Before I begin, I need you to consider something. Your lack of existing didn't stop a life from being imposed. You didn't exist at one point in time, yet a life was still imposed. Cells came together and formed a clump of cells, and then that clump of cells started doing consciousness. And that clump of cells is what resulted in you. It was the coming to existence of a sentient body, a brain, just any old brain, that is what resulted in you. This is true for every single being that has ever existed. They didn't exist, yet their lack of existing wasn't able to stop a life from being imposed. And so, if you imagine a universe completely devoid of all life, then a life comes to exist in a universe. Then that's the life that's imposed. It doesn't matter if it's the body that's currently listening to this audio or if it's some other body. It's just a group of cells that starts doing consciousness and starts doing the you sensation. So, if it isn't one you, it's some other you. Either way, it's you. So there's no escaping one life or another from being imposed, because life comes from, the experience comes from matter. And this is something I hope that I get across in this video, that you're able to understand what I mean by all this, in case it isn't clear yet. So now I'm going to explain why Lawrence Anton is wrong, and why sometimes being born is the best possible thing that could happen. In Lawrence Anton's video, I'm Glad to Be Born, Debunked, Lawrence says in so many words that it's impossible for being born to be a better thing than never coming to exist. This, he says, is because not existing will always be better compared to existing, due to the fact that life always involves suffering, no matter how little. I'm going to show you why he's wrong, and why existing can sometimes be the very best possible scenario. First, I'll need you to imagine a universe completely devoid of all life. Then imagine that you pop into existence. But this existence sucks very badly. You're experiencing the worst possible amount of suffering a sentient being is capable of, but without dying. So the only experience there is in the universe is the experience of terrible suffering. Now imagine that somehow, for the sake of this thought experiment, your brain splits in two. The two hemispheres detach from one another. And in the same way a cell divides, your entire body divides into two separate yous. Now, that other half of the brain is in this separate body. So now there's two separate conscious experiences. However, this second you isn't suffering at all. In fact, they're feeling quite fine. You're still suffering. So the division of the single brain has caused the existence of another conscious experience. I'll call it the good experience. Before splitting, that hemisphere was experiencing the suffering, since it was physically attached to the other half. When the division occurred, it was very much like this second you was born, a kind of birth of a separate being. So it was the act of being born that is what spared it from the experience of suffering, a sort of escape. And so it is good for that second being that it came to exist. Now I'm tasked with the burden of showing you how this thought experiment is applicable to reality. I need to convince you that the not suffering you, being separate from the suffering you, isn't different from being born as a person with a good life in a universe that also contains lives full of suffering. Your birth, just like the birth of the second you in the thought experiment is what may have blocked a much worse experience. To do this, I'll need to make up a new thought experiment. Once again, imagine a universe with only one being, and that being is, for some reason, suffering terribly. And so the only experience there is the experience of suffering. There's just suffering. But now, far, far away, somewhere else in the universe, a completely new being comes to exist. And this being is feeling quite fine. It's not suffering at all. So now this new brain introduces the good experience. But before it existed, there was only suffering experience. So my question is, how is this new being coming to exist any different than the second being in the first thought experiment coming to exist? In both thought experiments, we started with only the suffering experience, and then the act of introducing a separate being is what created an alternative to the suffering experience, thereby sparing the second being from the suffering experience. Now imagine that in this new thought experiment, that both of these two separate beings are brought together, and then somehow the two separate brains, two whole brains, are merged into one big brain with 4 hemispheres. So now, once again, there's only the suffering experience. The good experience has ceased to exist. Merging the two brains canceled it out. Now, imagine that we separate those two brains once again, so that there's once again two separate experiences, the good experience and the suffering experience. So now you can see that the second being has, by virtue of merely existing as a separate being, been spared from the suffering experience. And this is how it is possible that you being born could have been a very, very good thing, considering all of the suffering experiences that exist in the universe. By virtue of being a separate being apart from the suffering experience, you were spared from potentially much worse experience than the one you're currently experiencing. If, right now, there was only one experience in the entire universe, no matter the brain that's responsible for it, that would be the brain responsible for self-experience. And so that would be the only you there is. That's all you are. A brain is doing you right now, the you experience. So it isn't a matter of who you are, it's more a matter of which brain is responsible for the you. Remember, everyone refers to themselves as I. I hope I've shown you why your birth might have been a very good thing for you. It may have been a much better alternative to a universe in which you didn't come to exist.